Thank you very much, Darren. Great to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for coming and listening. I will cover off my knowledge on Canadian Pacific. The rules apply to Canadian Pacific as they do to other operating railroads. So even if CP is not in your community directly, I may be able to address the question if it's operational or if it's rules based or presence based. Just so you're aware, my counterpart from CN will be around the convention, I think tomorrow and Tuesday, and can probably direct you to Brent if your question is specific to CN. It's not true that Darren, that there's no CP cap in the room. In fact, there are three. They're under Darren's control, and you'll forgive me for taking that particular risk. Those are there for what Darren will deem to be really good questions. This is solely his discretion, and I, for one, am not sure about putting my hands in that particular fate, but nonetheless, here we are. I've also got some CP pins. I will be doing a head count afterwards, so help yourself if you wish at the end of this session. Know that no question is off bounds. While my comments today are going to be focused on the world post Lac Mégantic, I know that railroads impact your employers in your communities very directly, and happy to address questions about grain service or potash, market conditions, whatever you want. So without further ado, just a little bit about CP and my role within CP. As Darren mentioned, we have a presence in 6 Canadian provinces and 13 states. We are the smallest of the large North American railroads. We are trying to grow. You may have seen some headlines around that. We have about 14,000 miles of track. We touch on the major interchange points of Chicago, Kansas City, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and if there is a Saskatchewan, as they say, has what the world wants, and we are very much at the heart of trying to get those products to market. I think in general, we do a pretty good job of it. We also have some responsibilities, though, in terms of being present in your communities and in helping you with emergency planning within your communities. And that's never so true as post Lac Mégantic, and we've really worked hard to improve that presence. CP these statistics are from 2014. The 2015 stats are just being produced. But know this about CP. We have been for a decade now the North American safety leader. That leadership did continue in 2015. And safety for us is one of 5 core values that we as employees carry with us every day. For myself, I wear 2 hats at the company. I am head of government relations. I also am an occasional train conductor. Trained and qualified. I qualified a few years ago. I have operated trains in Saskatchewan, both down to the border and from Moose Jaw, both east and west. For me, that training gives me the ability to talk to you in the first person about our operations and hopefully to build some understanding around the operation. And that's what I hope you'll get out of today. We are highly regulated. We are under the jurisdiction of the Government of Canada, but you are our neighbors, and our employees live in your communities. We are very much tied at the hip, and we want to have that dialogue. Starting off with Lac Mégantic, which obviously is a key focus and the reason that the SUMA board approached me about doing this presentation. In the years since Lac Mégantic, there's been a significant amount of change, but let's start off by talking about what actually happened at the incident. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada, in its most thorough investigation in its history, identified 18 contributing factors. This wasn't a failure. This was a colossal failure. The company involved in the incident at Lac Mégantic had what I would consider to be a casual relationship with rail safety. But that wasn't the only problem. The regulator made some exceptions to their operations based on what were probably well-intentioned requests at the time. That included train crew size, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Another factor, though, involved train speed. And I've had this question at several councils as I move across the territory related to CP train speed. And Ed Sombor, sitting over there, very experienced in railroad regulation, could certainly, I think, verify me on that point. I'll start off with the regulatory change. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. This information is very well communicated by Transport Canada, but just to summarize it, Transport Canada post-Lac Mégantic has issued emergency directives on crew size, confirming the two-person crew is the standard. The train involved in Lac Mégantic was operated by a single-person crew under an exemption from Transport Canada. CP, we've always operated a minimum of two-person crew, sometimes more than two people. We had no plans to go down to a single-person crew, and now with the regulation reconfirmed, we won't be doing it. We wouldn't be able to do so in any case. On train securement and handbrakes, quite honestly, the rule was a good one. It wasn't followed at all in Lac Mégantic, but the rule said at the time of the incident, you must apply sufficient handbrakes when tying down a train. What does sufficient mean? Sufficient means something quite different in where I'm from, on the coast, than it does here in Saskatchewan. We have significant grades that are not, except in a couple of very specific locations in Saskatchewan, apparent. So at the top of Rogers Pass, you're applying a lot more handbrakes to keep a train from moving than you are in, say, Mydale. On braking and on the DOT 111s, let's talk a little bit about the DOT 111s. First off, tank cars are not owned by the railroads. The tank cars are owned by the product producers, by third-party leasers. Our mandate is to move the tank cars, and there are specific rules about how we move them. In the railroad industry, we have for some time believed the standards needed to be upgraded. And in fact, the tank car owners themselves moved to upgrade standards prior to Lac Mégantic, with the gradual adoption of what is known as the J1232, the successor tank car. These have more robust shieldings at either end of the car. The DOT 111 will be phased out by the end of next year, in service for dangerous goods. The successor tank car, the 1232, will be phased out by 2020. The next edition of the car, the TC 117, is going into production as we speak. The difference between the 1232 and the 117 is that the 117 has an additional heat blanket around the shell of the car. What we have found in incidents subsequent to Lac Mégantic is that sometimes the heat of a fire will ignite product well after the incident has happened. So the additional heat shielding is an added layer of protection. One of the first priorities that your first responders will tell you when responding to a railroad fire is to manage the temperature at the site. And that's the reason you see those water curtains sprayed on the cars. It's not so much to put out the fire that's burning, you let that burn. It's to control additional heat providing additional fuel for the fire over time. So you want to turn the temperature down on the entire area, not just focus on the fire that's burning. Under the Transportation of Dangerous Goods Act, Transport Canada has issued protective directives on testing and documentation. The product involved in the Lac Mégantic incident was mislabeled. Wouldn't have made a difference to the outcome of the incident, but as a technical fact, it was mislabeled. It was labeled in a lower explosive category. Those of you that are familiar with Bakken crude should be aware that the government of North Dakota has enacted some pretty specific labeling requirements as a result of this incident. The information reporting has improved significantly, and I believe that is true in Canada as well. I think the process is now identical between the two countries, and that is an improvement. On information sharing, my industry has worked very closely with FCM on information sharing, and we have some innovative products, one of which I'll show you as a result. But know this, under Protective Directive 3.2, you can apply to Transport Canada for information which we will transmit to you regarding dangerous goods. That application is typically made by your EMO or your fire chief. Once we are informed by Transport Canada that you have made the application, we will transmit that information to you. It is done so under a confidentiality agreement. I'll talk more about that in a bit. So that information is available to you. We also have a requirement now to have in place emergency response plans for crude and for ethanol, adding to some of the other products where ERAPs are required. What you should know is this. Railroads for some time, in fact it predates Lac Mégantic, have been in favor of many of these changes. In particular, the increased tank car standards. But we are not the owner of the cars. At the end of the day, our legal requirement under the Canada Transportation Act and under the Rail Safety Act is to move the cars from place to place and do so safely. So we were an advocate for increased tank car standards, but ultimately it wasn't our cost. It was the cost accrues to the tank car owners. And Transport Canada, similarly the Federal Railroad Administration, the United States had to negotiate that with the tank car owners. Again, the change is apparent, we support it. Now focusing on CP a little bit and our emergency response capabilities. This first slide gives you a sense of where our equipment is located, and I'll detail that equipment in a moment. But it includes foam trailers. It includes hazmat officers. It includes specially trained train masters, boom caches, emergency transfer trailers. We have greatly increased the resources that we dedicate to emergency response post-Lac Mégantic. This is what the transfer trailer looks like. This has all the fittings necessary for any of the varieties of valve that are out there. We have 6 of these trailers across the property. Closest one, I believe, is in Calgary, and it can be here in about 7 hours. It has been deployed 2 incidents in Saskatchewan over the last couple of years. This is what our firefighting foam trailers look like. We have 18 of these across the property. Closest ones, one is based in Weyburn, one is based in Saskatoon, in the care of the Saskatoon Fire Department, in fact. These can be moved one of 3 ways. They can be moved on the road as a trailer, they can be moved by rail, or they can be helicoptered. Interestingly, we have never deployed one of these to one of our own incidents. But through mutual aid, we had one in Lac Mégantic. We had one in Gogama, Ontario at Brand X derailment. Brand X, of course, not being here today, so I'm not going to mention them by name. These are our boom container uh, systems. The picture doesn't really describe what it is, but you have 20-foot containers stored across the property. Each contains 1,000 feet of 6x6 river boom, ropes, personal protective equipment, anchor kits, absorbent booms. We have used these in a couple of incidents over the last couple of years. And this equipment is maintained on a ready-to-go status all the time. Finally, we have 3 operational command trailers. Those of you outside of major urban centers will appreciate that often an incident happens out in the countryside, and there may not be that many resources present. These operational command trailers have cellular and satellite connections. They've got computers, televisions, printers, all the equipment that one needs for incident command, and they can be deployed to a site with relative ease. In a 24/7 news cycle, some of this type of equipment is extremely helpful as you move through the recovery phase of an incident, and that's where they're focused. This is brand new. This is our CP911 training tank car. Many of you are familiar with the TransCare tank cars that have traveled North America for a number of years now. This supplements that training service and is dedicated to CP training. If you see the red tank car rolling through your community, it's on its way to a training exercise somewhere. And this was just put into service in the fall, actually. Finally, on outreach, we have really increased our outreach resources. I've appeared before some of your councils, happy to appear before the rest of your councils to do what we call a phase 1 training or education exercise. This is good basic knowledge on railroad operations, on our emergency response capabilities, on some of the rules that are a most common source of frustration, say around block crossings or whistles. It's good sort of basic knowledge about railroad operations. We also do Railroad 101. That is specific training for your first responders done by our dangerous goods officers. Railroad 101 gives you access to certain future training opportunities, such as specific crude by rail training down at a training center in Pueblo, Colorado. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. We are big fans of the tabletop exercise. I see Lloyd over here. We did one in Grenfell about a year and a half ago. I do about 5 or 6 a year across the property. Always remember with a tabletop, it is your opportunity to test your emergency plan. That's what it's there for. Our job is to resource the emergency plan and to supplement it. Ultimately, we want to be in a situation where we establish a unified command at an incident site. But your first responders are going to be there ahead of our first responders. So this is a test of your community emergency plan. We are big fans of the tabletop exercise. We on occasion will do full-scale mocks. As somebody who has done these a lot in a lot of different guises over the years, I can tell you I'm personally not a big fan of them. I find they are exceptionally resource intensive without any of the learning or without additional learning that you gain through a tabletop. Finally, TransCare. This is jointly done with the Chemistry Council of Canada, training specifically on tank cars and the very wide variety of regulated commodities that we move, dangerous goods that we move. Terrific training for communities. I participated personally in one in Moose Jaw this past summer. There were not only Moose Jaw Fire Department, but also the surrounding RM volunteer fire departments were part of that training. I think we put through in excess of 100 first responders over a 2-day period. Great training. Finally, I mentioned the training at at CERTC down in Pueblo, Colorado. This is one of the first fire departments that went through that training was Regina. For obvious reasons, they have very strong hazmat capabilities within the Regina Fire Department, so it was important to get them through early, because through mutual aid, it's very likely that they would be deploying to an incident outside of Regina. The training is very hands-on. We do set fires, we do blow things up. It is entirely done at cost to the railroad. So the only thing that we ask of you is that you make your first responders available and get them to the airport, closest major airport. From that point on, it's on our dime. In 2016, we will have 80 seats at CERTC available for training. They do fill up pretty quickly. We don't bias them urban versus rural because the urban fire departments tend to have greater hazmat equipment or experience. We think it's important to get them through as well. But the offer is made to all fire departments, be they fully staffed, be they voluntary. So again, we want you to have the Railroad 101 experience before you go down so that we have a base level of knowledge, and then this augments that. We have the CP Community Emergency Planning Guide. This is available and easily to download from the CP website. The web address is there on the screen. A lot of the information that I'm imparting to you today is contained in the emergency planning guide. A good reference to have for your emergency management officer, a good reference for your fire chief to have. Finally, the Ask Rail app. This is new. This goes well beyond Protective Directive 3.2, which was the information disclosure. We've heard through FCM and through SUMA and others a desire for real-time information on dangerous goods. The logistics of coordinating real-time information are problematic. If it were a daily email, if it were a daily fax, well, somebody would be doing nothing but reading those reports. It wasn't practical. There was also some concern about disclosure on a daily disclosure. The industry has come up with this app, which we will provide to anybody who has gone through the Railroad 101 training. It's not for you. It is for your fire chiefs. It is for your firefighters. What it does, starting going right to left on the screen, you input the car. Every rail car in North America, for those of you that don't know, has a series of numbers and letters, a license plate, if you will, stenciled on the side. You've all seen those. You enter in the car number, and the car search result comes out immediately. If it's if it contains a hazardous good, it says so. The really cool part of the app is that beyond telling you what's in that specific car, you can then click on View Train and see what's on either side. Often in a derailment, what is in the adjoining cars is equally important to know. Is it hazardous? Is it last contained? Is it purged? A purged car might be just as dangerous as a last contained car if it gets heated up too much. Air will expand inside the car, it will burst. So knowing what is around a given car is equally important. The Ask Rail app also contains emergency, the dangerous goods information contained in the orange book. You simply click on the UN code. That information is, of course, placarded on the side of the rail car. That hasn't changed. This simply gives a real-time piece of information to first responders at the scene. The existing requirements for information, such as all this information, is also in the possession of the conductor on board the train. That hasn't changed. The information is transmitted through the Protective Directive 3.2 on an annual basis, segmented by quarter. That hasn't changed. This is enhanced information for first responders at a site. As I said, we want them to go through Railroad 101 so that we are confident they know what they're looking at. And that training is available on request to CP. That gets me, so that's changed over the last few years. Gets me to what else needs to change, because there's more. I'm going to start off by talking about the proximity guidelines. These were developed by Federation of Canadian Municipalities and the Railway Association of Canada. Surely, post Lac Mégantic world, we're all smart enough to realize that locating households, that locating schools or community centers in direct proximity to railroad tracks is perhaps a questionable decision. We can't do anything about what's already there. And that's not what the proximity guidelines are about. Proximity guidelines speak to the future. They give you, as a planning authority, some guidance as you review development applications. They are typically and routinely ignored. And that's a real frustration for us. Because at the end of the day, people don't necessarily look over the fence at what's behind and what they've bought. And then they come to us and they say, your operations are making noise, I can't sleep. They go to you and they say, that vibration is cracking my foundation. Or worse, they get evacuated as a result of a derailment. And they look at you and they go, I didn't know there were dangerous goods rolling past my backyard every day. You hear that every single day if you have residents who live in direct proximity to the tracks. The guidelines speak to the future. I strongly encourage their adoption in your planning processes, but recognize there is a cost. Why, for developers, is it very attractive to build next to a major industrial activity such as railroading? Typically, the land is cheaper. And at the end of the day, they too need to make a buck. They can convert, quote unquote, industrial land to residential, and they can make a pretty good profit doing it. Any mid to large size urban center knows that story very well. It takes some leadership on your part to push back and say, you know what? We're going to observe these guidelines. We're going to observe this mandate. Strongly encourage you to take a look at them. I do sit on the Proximity Government Relations Committee. We are looking at increasing our mandate to go after provincial governments on proximity. Ontario has now mandated that all municipalities adopt the proximity guidelines, but they're the only province that has done so. And on one level, you don't ever like to have other orders of government telling municipalities what to do, but in some ways it takes you guys off the hook if you're forced to incorporate as opposed to doing so voluntarily. The other one I wanted to talk about is infrastructure. This is a railroad screenshot of CP's main line, the Weyburn subdivision between Wilcox, Saskatchewan, and Weyburn and the city of Weyburn. All those yellow dots are level crossings. For us, in the railroad business, the level crossing is the single biggest risk we do not control. Somebody's decision to run the crossing, to be inattentive, or, sadly, to use it for their own purposes in a suicide, there are very real consequences to us. And there could be very serious consequences to the surrounding community. We can't change behavior. Also, railroading has evolved, and I'm going to argue that the grid road system that overlays the province is perhaps incompatible at this point with standard railroad operations. We move the goods that Saskatchewan produces. We have to do so efficiently. We have to do so safely. Part of doing it efficiently is using the assets that we own to the most effective use. A short train, if you multiply the number of crews, you multiply the number of locomotives cost about $5 million a piece. The more shorter trains we run, the greater cost we inject into our operation. So there's an economic incentive for us to lengthen out our trains. Under the Canadian operating rules, we can't be stationary on a crossing for more than 5 minutes. So if we have a meet somewhere, we have to be very aware of how long the train is and whether or not we're going to block crossings as a result, because the crew, by virtue of geography, is going to be out of compliance with the rules. As a conductor, I don't want to be in that position. I don't want the investigation to come down on me for a poorly planned meet. So I'm going to say to you that it's time to look at the grid roads. It's time to look at the number of crossings that exist and pose the question, do we still need this crossing? What do we use it for? Is it one vehicle a day? Is it 10? Is it 100? Is it 1,000? It's a good time to do this. Transport Canada brought into force a new grade crossing regulation a couple of years ago, and that set a clock for all of you who are road authorities to do an engineering assessment of your existing crossings. You have until, I believe it's 2020, to do so. So you're going to be looking at your crossings over the next few years regardless. Pose yourself the question, is this a cost I want to continue to absorb? Is this crossing necessary? At the end of the day, there are probably some crossings out there that could be closed with little to no impact on your residents. There are going to be some that can't be closed. We get that. But it's a reasonable time to pose the question. It's one of the things I want to leave with you. Finally, this number needs to be in your emergency plan. It needs to be your fire chief's phone. It needs to be in your police chief's phone or your division superintendent's phone. This is the CP Police emergency line. It is answered 24/7. It is the number that is posted on the back of every set of crossbucks in this country, along CP tracks, I should say. CN has a similar number. It's posted on the back of their crossbucks. Anything happening, you see sparks off a train. Train has derailed. There's a vapor cloud. Anything out of the ordinary. Somebody's trespassing on the tracks. Phone the CP Police. It's your first point of contact. It's as important as 911. That concludes my presentation. Obviously, It's hard to generalize with railroad operations. It's hard to generalize from community to community. So really, I wanted to push through the presentation quickly so that we could open up the Q&A and give you the opportunity to ask questions, because there's going to be specific information that you want. I'm pretty good at answering questions. I'm pretty good about being blunt. And we're here to learn. So let's take the opportunity. Darren will moderate, and as I said, Darren's going to choose 3 of you who ask quote-unquote particularly good questions, and you get the CP Toque.
Thank you, Mike. I think you can hear me. And you already know what you're doing. I don't need to tell you. We're going to get you to line up at the mic. And again, I'll remind you, I'd like your name, your community name. Be as quick in your introduction to your question as possible. 1 question per person, and I'm going to stick to that rule until we've given everybody an opportunity. Then we will go to a second question for those that are interested. Question here before.
Oh, sure. There.
And right off the bat, the first question.
Well,
First hat.
whoa, right on.
Make it a good question.
Well, yes. Well, you know, I don't know if you're going to
No
like.
pressure.
No pressure. My name is Nancy Stiles, and I'm a councillor from the city of Weyburn. And of course, CP Rail goes through Weyburn, and there we have 3 controlled crossings there. No, 4. Sorry, 4. And I guess I have because you obviously don't like crossings at all. One of the things that I would like to see, if possible in the future, I haven't raised any money for it yet, but Tadico Parkway is one of the 7 urban parks in Saskatchewan, and our trails, there's not a natural hookup, but there could be a natural hookup to go from one part of it to the other if we had a controlled pedestrian crossing near Barber Motors. And I mean, would CP have any flavor to work with the city of Weyburn to get that pedestrian crossing? And I mean, I've seen these. They are controlled. They have gates that go clunk shut. So I mean, if a train's coming through, it's perfectly safe. So would CP have any flavor to work with the city of Weyburn to get a controlled pedestrian crossing for Tadico Parkway?
Nancy, the last thing we want to see is another crossing in Weyburn. No, candidly. That said, you could upgrade crossings just to the north of the park. It's in pretty close proximity. But there was a reason I kind of alluded to Weyburn in that other slide. The north end of the city, you've got Queen Street, which is uncontrolled. Right on a curve, what is it, maybe 15 feet from Highway 39, maybe? Queen Street will never survive the grade crossing review. It won't. It'll get.
I'm not looking at that.
I know, but the point is, we've got to deal with what we've got, and there are options in Weyburn in terms of locating a proper pedestrian crossing, if you will, right where the existing controlled crossings are. Adding another crossing in the middle of the park is not actually a step forward, and further tightens up our ability to operate. Now, there's enough, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that in that, 500 feet between the 2 crossings, if we were to put another crossing in, it wouldn't change our operation. But the reality is we need fewer crossings, not more of them. What we should be looking at for the medium to long term in Weyburn, and I would argue in many other communities, is for a grade separation. That is the safest type of crossing. There is a tremendous amount of infrastructure money out there from other orders of government. Those budgets are going up. CP wants to be your advocate in terms of garnering one in your community. And I think that's where we should be focusing our attention.
Had to ask.
Fair enough. Knew it was coming.
Hello, Tracy Yowzy, town of Kalonze. My question is, how many firefighters in the province of Saskatchewan have the Railway 101 safety program to date, and how else can this information be related to us in an emergency situation if we do not have the safety program?
I don't know the number in Saskatchewan. The number system-wide is the number I do have off the top of my head. And that is 2,300, just over 2,300 first responders since we started this program a few years ago. In Kalonze directly, I don't believe we have done the Railroad 101 training. I don't believe it's been requested. It's something that should happen.
Yeah, so we are a main line for
Yep.
CP.
Yeah. So let's deal with that offline, you and me. But obviously, we're keen to do it. It'll be our dangerous goods officer, Doug Mayer, who leads that training. And that information, that's contact information that your fire chief should have.
No, yeah, I guess what I'm asking really is, if a disaster happened tomorrow,
Yep.
can we obtain the information on what's on the car that's
Yes.
burning and the cars that?
Oh, this is a good question, Darren.
I think he
The-
just gave you a hat.
That information has always been on board the train. What the disclosure requirements that have happened since Lac Mégantic did not change that. So I, as a conductor, when I take my train, I print out a document called a compressed waybill that has the dangerous goods information for every dangerous good contained in that, on that train. I keep that information in my possession. Should an incident occur, my job is to transmit that information to the first responders arriving at the scene. The documentation is backed up in our computer system and can be communicated over, let's say I get incapacitated. How do you know what that information is? You can get that through the CP Police Service, transmitted over the phone, by fax, by email. The documentation is backed up. So there's numerous ways that we're pre-existing to transmit the information. That hasn't changed. What the app does, what the Protective Directive 3.2 do, is they give you enhanced information.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Corbin Meyer, Councillor Town of Langham. I can't take your hat because I don't want to offend the conductors out there. We're on the CN main line. But the question is, have you ever seen, or do you know of maybe even a major urban center in the States, because I live probably within that area that you're talking about where land was cheap, and I mean, it's a small community, so that's just where it is, but
Yep.
It's within a few hundred meters of the track. And so my question is, have you ever seen anybody build sidewalls up as a preventative to, like in a narrow corridor where residences or schools or something are really close? Could you build a sidewall to prevent an accident from happening?
I haven't seen one designed for dangerous goods containment, let's say. What I have seen is sound attenuation walls. We've got them in a number of locations along CP lines, and the proximity guidelines, though, to your question, they do address that in part, and they do provide some design standards for. It's mostly geared towards sound attenuation,
Yeah.
but they do address that directly.
Thank you.
Guy Pulvermacher, councillor for the town of Bruno. We're on one of the main CN lines, a lot of freight going through. We have a fairly small volunteer fire department, brand new fire chief. Half of our members have joined within the last year. What are 3 points you can give us on how to get our team up to speed and the most important way to train them in the most effective way in a short time when they're already doing a lot of training,
Yep.
just become effective?
The training that CN offers, identical training to what I spoke about. Best way to get that is to request it. CN has a public information line. The email and phone number are on their website, cn.ca. Make that request. It's good knowledge for your fire department to have. In our case, and I believe it's true for CN as well, we don't say meet us in Regina on X and X date and we'll train you. We come to your training night, typically they're Tuesday nights, and do the training directly. We bring the equipment necessary for the training with us. We do like to pool it with adjoining fire departments. It just makes sense from a mutual aid perspective. It's also a good use of time for everybody. But beyond that, we'll bring the training to you, and I do know CN does the same thing.
My question goes a little bit further than just the training. What are the 2 or 3 things that our fire chief needs to know that are most important for him to do his job effectively? For instance, these websites or
Right.
having that app or that sort of thing.
Gotcha. The first thing is safety of the first responders. Don't approach a situation that you can't first assess. We follow the same incident command hierarchy as everybody, as all first responders. So that is safety of first response, safety of the surrounding community, protection of the environment, returning back into service. Those are the 4 steps. If you don't know what you're looking at, if you can't see the placard on the rail car, you don't know what that car contains. Maybe there's a cloud, maybe there isn't. Maybe it's just lying on its side. You need to get that information. How do you get that? If you don't know, go find the crew at the head end. If you can't find the crew, call the emergency line. So those are the 3 things.
Thank you.
I want to see the hat first. It's very feminine. I am Sylvia Meldron. I am mayor of the town of Unity. We have CN and we have CP. You have come out with the training. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
We are a town built between 2 rail lines. We have a half a dozen railroad crossings, and we have 2 major highways within a 1 kilometer square area of town. We have been lobbying for, in the name of safety, a different access to a provincial highway 21 because of safety. We have been doing this for over 20 years, and we're getting nowhere, not too fast. So, I'm thinking the light bulb went on, and at the top of this Highway 21 coming into our town is an uncontrolled railway crossing with your railroad, which also presents a huge safety factor, which we don't know what's on the train. We do know, but we don't know at the moment. And we don't know what's in those semis coming and going very often, with retarder brakes. I get anxiety thinking about it, and I'm not a worrier. So, perhaps we need to lobby CP also.
Unity is
a great town.
It's a terrific town.
Right.
It's a terrific town, but it is a poster child. It is a poster child for how not to build highways.
Oh, yes, that's why we're called Unity.
And
Yeah.
I mean, I can't justify the decisions of the provincial government on this one. That road should have been grade separated years ago.
But I'm talking, what are your decisions now to
Right.
provide safety to our town? Because you have as many on your line hauling dangerous goods.
Yep.
Right? Well, that's how you make your money. That's how we have safety concerns.
Yep. I'm very comfortable with the operation that we have, our observance of the rules, our enforcement of the rules. I am very uncomfortable with somebody driving on the highway trying to beat the train over the Highway 21 crossing. To my mind, that's the risk. When we look at CP, we have made investments in grade crossings. We look at it on business case. This is how we decide whether or not to contribute to somebody's project. If we can obtain some operational savings through the elimination of that crossing, then then we have a good business case to make internally to provide some funding for that project. For the most part, quite honestly, it's a pretty tenuous business case from our perspective. That doesn't change the public safety issue. It doesn't change the convenience issue for residents. And that's where we think we need to do a good job of verifying you as you advance a request to the provincial road authority, to the federal government, who has a lot of money for these sorts of trade-related infrastructure projects. Good case in point for us is the city of Edmonton. Any of you who know the southern boundary of Edmonton know that there's been a giant construction site the last couple of years as they have built a very big overpass over Highway 2 and over the CP main line. Our contribution to that project, and the project goes back about 7 years now, our contribution to it was our lobbying effort. And it was recognized as such in the project agreement that CP would be a verifier for this project, which was deemed to be in the national interest in terms of infrastructure. That's easy for us to do, and it's a role we should do. But you have to involve us in that. You in the town of Unity taking on an overpass project all by yourself is, one, a severe financial burden on your budget, and two, is not beyond the obvious public safety benefit. I would argue you shouldn't be going alone, that you should be getting other government sources of funding, and they're out there. So let's work together on it.
I need your name and number. Thank you.
Done.
There's no question better than another question, but you did call Mike's hat feminine, so you get that.
Hi, my name is Samantha, and I am the CAO for the Village of Sedley, which is along the longest, straightest piece of railway in the province of Saskatchewan, which is managed by or owned by Shoreline Railway.
Yep.
Will CP do emergency training for first responders along a railway that belongs to somebody else?
Under mutual aid, yes, we will respond. But do we do the training? It depends. If we're asked to, and some short lines have asked us to do training, we will. We do it on a cost recovery basis. But in terms of emergency response, it's done on mutual aid. We have mutual aid agreement with the other railroads. The issue of short lines came up in the earlier session as well, and in regulation around short lines. You know, when short lines were created, the policy for short lines was created many years ago. It was largely to keep country elevators in service where they were no longer economic for the large class ones to service. And you know, you can appreciate we have a very high cost basis to our operation. We have to meet certain standards. We have significant capital expenditures. We're expensive. A country short line was there to keep the prairie elevators in service when we could no longer justify the cost of service. We're not in the business of subsidizing. That's not how we make money. In fact, that's how we lose money, and we don't want to do that. So now Bach and Crude comes along. And suddenly, short lines are thrust into a position that they weren't really designed for out of the box. And yeah, we have some concerns. We certainly talked to the government of Saskatchewan about that. We believe in particular, similar, the railroad in Lac Mégantic was deemed a short line. It was a national short line because it crossed provincial and international boundaries, but it was deemed a short line in terms of its size. At the time, the insurance requirement for short lines nationally was $25 million, the liability requirement. And obviously that money was spent in about 15 minutes. I believe in Saskatchewan, the provincial regulation mirrors the federal regulation. There's recently been some movement on that front to increase the liability burden. A lot of the short lines they didn't wait. They've upped their liability insurance directly, not waiting for the regulation to tell them what to do. But this is an ongoing issue. It is one, as I said, we have expressed some concern to the province of Saskatchewan about, with good reason. Some of you may be aware that we originated the train that derailed in Lac Mégantic. We originated that train in North Dakota. We are currently being sued by the province of Quebec for $400 million. We had nothing to do with the operation of the Montreal, Main and Atlantic. We're required under Canadian law to interchange with them. When we chose not to interchange with them post-Lac Mégantic, they hauled us before the Canadian Transportation Agency, which ordered us to resume interchange. And whatever you think of those facts, recognize this. You don't, at the end of the day, as a railroad, you don't want us to decide whether or not to move the chlorine that is required for your town water supply, water filtration plant. Better that the Common Carrier Obligation apply, better that the Rail Safety Act apply, and we are required to move all commodities, including dangerous goods, and do so safely. But as it pertains to short lines, there's more to talk about. And it's not regulation that touches us directly, but downstream, it could touch us, as in the case of this lawsuit. So we have, as I said, we've expressed some concerns. We will, on a mutual aid basis, provide support, and on a cost recovery basis, we would provide training.
And that request would have to come from the short line, or?
Yeah, from the short line to us.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you, Samantha. Don't see any other people ready for questions. Nancy, did you have a second one? No. Absolutely. Yeah, we still have.
We got loads of time.
Lots of time.
Vince Labossiere, Cut Knife. I would. I have a little question, but you've sure done your homework, and you've done a real good presentation here today. I know you're out of hats, so don't worry. I'm not.
You still get
funny.
a pen.
Oh, sure. On the topic of infrastructure, especially the roads, which you brought up, and I can see how it's a big concern of yours vis-a-vis the railway company. I'd like to point out the obvious, too. Have you noticed some of the implements that the farmers are pulling out in the field today?
Yes.
Large ammonia tanks and large trains, well beyond the gravel roads engineered specs.
Yep.
Bridges, all the like. So the challenges are not just CPs, they are an overall concern. But you are speaking to a room of people who represent ratepayers.
Yes.
And there was a time when we perceived a need, we could address it in our budgetary approach. But in the last century, things were introduced like income tax and so on, where it gives larger governments a bypass approach to the wealth of the commoner. So vis-a-vis these areas of major infrastructure dollars, we are challenged. The budgets of our RMs are challenged. And I think you've noticed some improvements. It just can't happen all overnight. And there's, of course, we have the haves and the have-not RMs, right? Those that can have funding and those that cannot. I just would like to point out a perspective. We discovered in Wilton and in Hillsdale, and I'm not speaking as an authority, I'm just saying I'm a trucker in the oil patch. And we decided to pull triaxle trailers, finding out that it was wrecking our intersections. And then we really looked at the cost and the rates we were being paid and so on, the economy of it. And we really discovered that pulling tandems were more cost effective at the end of the day, but we're still pulling triaxles.
Right.
So profitability cannot just take the view of the one hand. Because in order for the triaxle to be sustainable, it means the taxpayer has to pay more money in infrastructure on those roads so that the oil company and the trucking companies can make more profit. Same with CP. We want to improve. We want safety. There, you don't have to preach it. We want it. But the kind of dollars we're looking at to get some change happening in a 5 to 10 year window, and your notions that there is more money available, on our council, we don't see it. But I hope your assumptions are a good forecast of things to come, but we're under a big challenge facing us in the next few years here with not just the low oil price, but it's going to feel through the whole system.
If I could, the easiest expenditure to make is not to make an expenditure. It's not for me to dictate how you divvy up your funds, but particularly for RMs. In many cases, you know, if we go back to that slide, where is it? There. I'm just going to ask the question, do you really need that many crossings? Typically, you are junior at the crossing, which is a very arcane formula that the Canadian Transportation Agency came up with to divvy up costs for maintenance. Those costs typically fall on the road authority, which put in the road post-installation of the mainline track. So I'm going to ask the question, do you need to maintain all those roads, or do you simply say, you know what, this, you and I both know, in many cases, they are theoretical roads. They're not even actually roads, but there's still a crossing there. We still come in every number of years and do the plank replacement and send you the bill at the end. Do we need to spend all that money? My guess is we don't, but it's actually your decision. So all I would say is take it back and look at it in your jurisdiction and make some informed decisions.
Yes, sir. And I was trying to connect the dynamic of if the RM proved that pulling tandem trailers was more cost effective, your profit and taxpayer combined, right? Trying to take the bigger view of things. We now have trains of a mile long. Why not 2 miles long? I'm just saying maybe part of profitability is not having to pull such big trains on the kind of train tracks we have currently in use.
That's the reason we don't have 2 mile long trains. CP, our typical siding is roughly 7,800 feet long. That precludes a 2 mile long train. That's about 1.5 miles. We have, over the last 4 or so years, had a very focused program on lengthening out sidings. Some of you may be familiar with Centennial just south of Estevan, which is now a 12,000 foot long siding. There's relatively few places in the network where we can build one that long because of the grade crossings and the fact that we can't occupy a crossing for more than 5 minutes. And if you're going to do a train meet, odds are you're there for more than 5 minutes. So we build them where we can. What a longer train means is fewer trains. There's a very direct correlation there. They're certainly a more efficient train to operate. So good for our business. and good for our neighbors in the fact that instead of having 2 trains come through, you have 1. And at track speed, that extra 4,000 feet, 3,000 feet is going to go by pretty quickly. So we like longer trains. That's certainly the trend in the business, but we're somewhat capacity limited right now in terms of being able to have a long train. That's why you don't see them all going out at 12,000 feet. Technologically, there's, in terms of the locomotive, in terms of the train control, there's no reason not to. We actually, for grain trains going across northern Ontario for a while, we were stapling together 2 113-car grain trains and putting them across over the Great Lakes as one train. These are monsters, 226 cars, about 3 miles long. They ran beautifully, but you got to have the infrastructure to be able to get 2 trains to meet, which is not an issue with trucking, where typically, even if it's a range road, there's enough space for 2 trucks to pass each other at speed.
You sit in quorums and forums that we as people are not privy to. So I just wanted to give you the human perspective of the ratepayer.
I appreciate that.
And that it's about available tax dollars and it's about quality of life. A mile-plus train covers 2 intersections.
Yep.
Not 1. Just saying, profitability of the corporation cannot be viewed in isolation of quality of life and meaningful living for citizens. And I just wanted to thank SUMA for having the opportunity to, even as a shepherd of the people, if you will, elected shepherd, to be able to bring that kind of dialogue to you, trusting, again, because of your presentation, you have done your homework, and I hope you don't lose that human component to your roundtable discussions. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you.